Good afternoon. Welcome back and welcome if you're joining us for the first time today. My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada and our communications director, Jose Sanchez, I'd like to welcome you to our session, Learning to Trust My Spiritual Life, Accompanying LGBTQ plus persons in the Ignatian tradition, presented by Father Gilles Mongeau. A father will speak for approximately 1 hour, followed by Q&A. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. I'll now ask Jose to talk to you about translation and technical.
Thank you, Pat. Welcome, everyone. For this part, I'll switch to French just to make sure that everyone is in the language of their choice. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre réunion ou de votre session, cliquez sur Interprétation, le bouton Interprétation, et cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans les contrôles de votre réunion, ou de la session, appuyez sur le bouton avec les 3 petits points et après, appuyez sur Interprétation de la langue. Et finalement, appuyez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. And another reminder, as Patricia said, remember that you can ask questions through the Q&A button, also at the bottom or top of the screen, like the interpretation button, depending on your device. And questions will be answered towards the end of the session. Once again, a reminder that the recordings for all of the sessions will be sent via email by 5 business days after the event. And if you have technical problems, remember you can always click on the tech support button in the main menu and ask for help. Thank you, Pat.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you Father Gilles Mongeau. He is a member of the Society of Jesus and Socius of the Jesuits of Canada. He was born in Montreal and raised in Ottawa. Reverend Dr. Mongeau did research at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland and at Boston College before completing his Doctor of Theology degree from Regis College and the University of Toronto in 2003. His doctoral research focused on Thomas Aquinas's use of rhetoric as an element of theological method. In addition to his ongoing research and teaching, Father Mongeau is a spiritual director and retreat chaplain. He worked with all-inclusive ministries at Our Lady of Lourdes Parish in Toronto. Thank you for being with us, Father, and it's over to you.
I want to thank Patricia and the organizers for this invitation to participate in this conference. And I want to thank you for participating in this event. I'm really grateful to be able to share some of my experience in this talk. I really want to keep this talk at the level of sharing experience. So there won't be any fancy graphics or other visual aids. I think it's best if this remains a little more conversational. So I have basically 3 things or 3 parts that I want to share with you. The first is really the experience of the people I have been accompanying. I think it's very important, since many people listening might not have lived this experience of being an LGBTQ plus person, being an LGBTQ plus Catholic. It's important to just tell some stories and use those stories to share with you some of the experience that people bring to a spiritual accompaniment in the Ignatian tradition, when they come to see me, when they come and ask for a little bit of accompaniment. Then I'd like to say something about what I've learned about myself as a spiritual director, accompanying LGBTQ people. What the Ignatian tradition has done for me as someone who accompanies LGBTQ persons. And then finally, I'd like to say a few things about the themes, the directions that the Ignatian tradition helps to, or provides, I should say, to persons who come looking for accompaniment. So with that in mind, let me just start with a little bit of context and then some storytelling. I entered the Jesuits at the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And from the beginning, walking with LGBTQ persons has been part of my life as a Jesuit. When I was a novice, I was sent to work at a crisis center, working with persons living with HIV and AIDS, with their family members, mainly manning phone lines. At the very start of the epidemic, as some of you will remember, we didn't know a lot about the illness. And not only was there a series of sort of medical unknowns, but there was also a lot of social and cultural unknowns. People didn't know what meaning to give to this experience. The LGBTQ plus community, the homosexual community in particular, the gay community in particular, was quite challenged by the pandemic, the HIV pandemic. And so right from the beginning of my Jesuit vocation, there was this sense of being called to walk with the LGBTQ plus community. One of the things that the pandemic did is that it brought forward into the public consciousness the fact that there are homosexual people out there. Not that there weren't major events that the gay community, the LGBTQ plus community, count as important, say Stonewall or other events of the gay liberation movement. But in terms of the broader mainstream public, homosexuality was something that was very much closeted. And what HIV and AIDS did was make homosexuality something public. The community became visible not just because of its suffering, but also because it revealed itself as a community, as a group that was capable of compassion, and as a group that desired to have life in society, that desired to have the freedom to exist in the world. And that too accompanied my journey through the Society of Jesus. It affected religious life as people in religious life, whether in the Jesuits or elsewhere, started coming out and expressing their needs for help, for support, for acceptance, a desire to be given a voice in religious life. It was quite a ferment all the way through my time in Jesuit formation. And finally, when I got to theology and was assigned to Our Lady of Lourdes Parish in Toronto, it became part of my ministry to walk with people, the LGBTQ plus community. When I came to Toronto for my theology studies in the last few years before ordination, we were at the height of the AIDS crisis in Toronto. People were dying all the time. And my work at Our Lady of Lourdes consisted in supporting the parish's outreach to people living with HIV and AIDS. And so there was a lot of accompaniment of people who were dying, of family members, of partners. And this accompaniment, not just by myself, but by other members of the parish staff, really exposed us to the pain of exclusion by family members and by the church, a pain that was made all the more vivid by the health crisis that people were undergoing. But also it brought to us, it revealed to us a deep desire on the part of gay men, mainly at the time, but I would say of the LGBTQ community at large, deep desire to be reconciled to the God that they had left behind when they thought that God had rejected them, when they experienced rejection from church and family. And I would say that that is the first thing I want to say about the spiritual experience of LGBTQ persons. It may be less intense now than it was then, but this basic experience of rejection deeply affects the self-understanding, the sense of self-love, self-trust, self-image of LGBTQ persons. As I say, it's probably less intense now as society has evolved, but it's not gone away. And so this would be one of the key spiritual experiences that people bring to accompaniment. I think with that desire for healing of self-image, for healing of relationship with God, there's a deep desire for there was a deep desire for spiritual depth. A lot of people needed tools to anchor themselves in the midst of a health crisis, in the midst of the AIDS pandemic, anchor themselves in their own experience so that they would have a place to stand, whether it was to face the rejection of society or to come to terms with themselves as they were coming out of the closet. There was a need for that interior depth that would ground them. At the same time, though, in many cases, as I walked with people, whether they were dying or whether they were partners or others in the community, there was a deep confusion about the meaning of their interior experience. Here's what I mean. The message that LGBTQ persons receive from society, from church, is that their interior life, because it's telling them that they're homosexual or trans or bisexual or lesbian or whatever, that their interior experience, their interior life is distorted, is unhealthy. And so many of them would come to the parish looking for spiritual accompaniment, looking for pastoral care, with a sense that they couldn't trust their own interiority. Many brought shame and guilt from years of being told that their orientation was sinful. Even as they lived their lives, you know, I would accompany people who had been happily partnered and had gone on to have great success in career or life, but even with that kind of peaceful life on the surface, people carried shame and guilt and a sense of self-hatred even sometimes that just wouldn't go away, that couldn't be a burden that couldn't be lifted. I want to give you two examples. I want to talk a little bit about Richard, who's the first man that I accompanied who was dying of AIDS. And I want to talk about Mark, who was not sick, but who was part of the healing mass community for people living with HIV and AIDS at the parish where I was. Richard was already hospitalized when I was asked to go and visit with him. And Richard had been rejected by family, had not spoken to family members for 25, 30 years, something like that, and was dying. He was in the advanced stages of Kaposi's sarcoma. Lesions were actually on his brain. And there was no hope of continued life. He was very happily partnered and had a very, on the surface, successful and peaceful life with his partner in Toronto. But as he was dying, he felt a deep need for reconciliation. And so I visited with him a number of times, and we had conversations just about what was on his mind. There really wasn't a sense of deep spiritual direction going on, just friendly conversation. But then one day I arrived for my usual visit with him at bedside, and he asked to hear he asked for me to hear his confession. Now, I wasn't a priest at the time, and I tried to say, well, I can't. He said, no, you are the one to whom I want to speak about this. And so we spent probably 2 hours with me listening to everything that was on his heart, and saying very little, but at the end saying to him that I felt that from what I had heard, that that God was there for him and wanted him to be consoled. I don't quite remember what I said, but basically the reconciliation in those 2 hours unfolded and happened. The next time I visited, Richard had a new request. He wanted to be reconciled with his family. His father had died. His father had kicked him out years ago, was now dead, but his sister and his mother were still there, still around. And so he asked me to contact them. I did, brought them to the hospital. And the two of them were obviously very uncomfortable and didn't know why they were there. But Richard was able, simply from the experience he had received of welcome and acceptance from God, from Christ, was able to offer the same thing to his mother and his sister. It was a beautiful moment. Why do I want to talk about this? Because what had happened for Richard was that in the encounter with God, who welcomed him home, as it were, who accepted him as he was, who showed mercy and forgiveness for whatever was heavy on Richard's heart, and he had not lived a blameless life. What he had been given, he was able to give. And I think that's very important in terms of Richard learning to trust this spiritual experience, this grace received from God. His learning that empowered him to share the same grace with others. And that's a very Ignatian reality. For Ignatius, we are saved by a gift, which we then share with others. Ignatius often uses that phrase, by that same grace. We love the neighbor by the same grace with which we have been loved by God. And so for me, that encounter was a very important moment of realizing how active God already is in the life of LGBTQ persons, unlike what you may often hear in the church or in the larger community. There is spiritual depth there. There is a spiritual life, and there are spiritual movements that can be trusted. And someone like Richard was able to touch that and collaborate with it. By contrast, Mark was a member of the healing mass community for people living with HIV and AIDS at Our Lady of Lourdes. But Mark came to the healing mass for himself, and specifically came to be healed of his homosexuality. That was really his purpose in coming to the Mass. And so he would ask for the sacrament of the sick in the hopes that the sacrament of the sick would heal him of his orientation. He had accepted, he had internalized the homophobia which had been directed at him. It internalized it deeply. He came to me for direction, and partly out of my experience with Richard, but with others as well, I had a sense that the most important thing that I could offer Mark was a path where I could accompany him towards self-acceptance. I was not concerned whether he would end up honoring the church's teaching to remain celibate or get a partner. That was not my concern at all. But I knew that he couldn't actually make a proper discernment about how he wanted to live his life unless he started with self-acceptance and a healing of that internalized homophobia. He was never able to do it. He was so fearful and so untrusting of his own interior experience that he remained blocked and eventually stopped coming for direction. That's the challenge that certainly at that time, but sometimes even today, even as the social situation has changed, and even the situation in the church has evolved a bit, not much. That's the challenge. Learning to trust my own interior experience, learning to allow myself to believe that God is already laboring there. And that's what differentiated Richard from Mark. The place where I next want to land is the experience of accompanying a man whose partner was Catholic, who was dying of AIDS, of the complications associated with the virus, who himself was not Catholic, but who, seeing his partner moving towards death with a certain amount of peace because of his faith, wanted himself to become Catholic. For me, that was an entry into another important element of the LGBTQ plus experience, which is that unlike what we may often be told, what I saw as I visited with this man was his care for his partner who was dying, his personal maturity and personal self-acceptance as a gay man, and the freedom that gave him to explore becoming Catholic, in spite of messages that he might be receiving from the church. That kind of self-acceptance, I think, has been growing in the gay community, in the LGBTQ community over the decades, over the years. And it changes the context quite a bit. Because again, having that level of self-acceptance gives one the freedom to engage with interior experience and trust it. His biggest obstacle was learning to pray with Jesus. He had already developed a certain spiritual life through Buddhist practices, through yoga. His main thing was entering into a relationship with Jesus. And that was a very new thing for him. But entering into a relationship with Jesus proved to be key. And this is, again, perhaps a place where the Ignatian tradition is very helpful, because it is so much focused on encountering Jesus as a friend, and developing an image of Christ, but an image of God as one who actively cares for me, who is actively involved in giving me good things. We could talk about the stance of the contemplatio of the spiritual exercises, the very last exercise that Ignatius proposes to people making the spiritual exercises, where one is invited to review all of the gifts one has received, not just in the retreat, but in one's life, and to see God as the one who has actively loved me and shown me that love in action, not as a concept, not as words, but as an active giving of gifts, sharing of life, sharing of self in Jesus. This man, growing into that awareness, became one of the pillars, really, of the parish. He was never involved with the HIV Mass, but he became an incredibly active member of the parish. And that's perhaps the next point I want to make, that this reception of God's love, this reception of God's gifts, frees one to offer that gift to others. It becomes the basis for one's own participation in the mission of Jesus, but in the life of the community. It empowers one to take a leadership role, if you will, and leadership can take many forms. I don't mean that somebody ends up being a minister, but just one is empowered to act with confidence and peacefulness as a participant in the mission of Jesus for the well-being of the world in the community. That reality is something that was also experienced by the HIV Mass community over the years. At the beginning of the HIV Mass, the focus was very much gathering around those who needed the support of the community because they were ill and perhaps dying with the complication because of the complications associated with the HIV virus, with AIDS. And so the focus initially was very much on the sacrament of the sick, on being present to the dying, on making sure that that people felt welcomed by God, felt welcomed by the church, and were granted a safe space, were offered a safe space within which to experience God's love as they were dying. But over the years, that safe space gradually opened up to include others. The HIV Mass became a place of safety for anyone in the LGBTQ plus community, for anyone who wanted to walk with LGBTQ persons as allies. And so the HIV Mass community over the years became a bridging community that had an apostolic purpose, that had, that word apostolic is maybe too technical, that had a sense of mission to be a welcoming place. I remember preaching about that a lot in the last few years that we had the HIV Mass community before we made the transition to all-inclusive ministries. It became aware, the community became aware that it had an agency, that it had a voice, that it had a presence in the parish that made LGBTQ people visible, and that was a good thing. That experience became foundational, I think, for the transition to the all-inclusive ministries Mass. But it also illustrates that Ignatian experience of being loved by God in act, being shown love in concrete active action, of reconciliation, healing, grieving with, but that action empowering one to then become an agent of reconciliation, peace, healing, one who can grieve with and walk with. I think the community experienced that, and that proved to be very foundational. It doesn't just happen in Ignatian spirituality to individuals, it happens to communities. And I want to talk about that a little bit more later. There was another experience at Our Lady of Lourdes for LGBTQ people, and that was the dignity, the monthly dignity gathering, which included shared reflection and shared food and a Mass. That monthly gathering of dignity began in, certainly when I began to walk with dignity a little bit. I didn't have an opportunity to do that very much, but a little bit. It began really as a place to grieve, I would say. A lot of the members of Dignity had experienced profound rejection and just needed time to process that. And so the shared reflection was incredibly important for people to process their lives, their experience, to celebrate who they were. There was a lot of anger and pain in I would say that particular generation of LGBTQ Catholic. That experience has changed, I must say. The kind of psychological woundedness that many gay men and other LGBTQ persons carried in those early years is not as present. Society has changed to a certain extent. Culture has changed to a certain extent. There's a more visible gay culture that's present. And so that kind of anger and pain at exclusion, for many, is just not as acute. I would say that where it's still present is with new immigrants to Canada who have had a very different experience in their home countries, but the woundedness, I would say in general, is less, and it's less of an issue. The other reality that I was walking with at the time was the encounter with gay liberation theology during my studies. And that was my introduction to a different kind of experience of being LGBTQ plus in the church. My peers in theology studies were younger. Again, as I just finished saying, they had not experienced the kind of rejection and exclusion. They didn't carry the kind of psychological woundedness, although there was still a lot of anger. But there was a confidence there and a very different kind of experience. The younger generation just brings a different history. The process of coming to terms with orientation, while it's still difficult, it's just different. If one experiences rejection in the family, there are other places where one can find belonging and acceptance. You know, my own work with Catholic school boards, implementing the pastoral guidelines for working with, walking with students, LGBTQ plus students, shows that there, even in Catholic high schools, there is this opportunity to find support and find help. And so there's just less of that psychological heaviness and more of that self-acceptance. At the same time, though, I would suggest that the social messaging about being LGBTQ plus, while it's on the surface more positive, is still mixed messaging. You'll hear a lot in the gay community, in the LGBTQ plus community, you'll hear a lot of people complaining that, for example, pride celebrations have become too commercialized and have been sort of taken over by commercial interests and a kind of very shallow messaging. There's a lot of worry and anxiety, for example, among some in the LGBTQ plus community, that the body messaging that's happening in gay targeted advertising, in pride celebrations, the image that's put out there, particularly of the male body, but in general, the sexualizing of or the genitalizing, even if you want to say that, of the gay experience is not a positive thing for young gay and lesbian persons it's a message that's not, it's mixed. You know, on the one hand, we see images of gay men and women, trans persons out there on television and movies, but it's a mixed message, and it has to be carefully discerned. There's an absence of role models still for young LGBTQ people. There's not the visibility that a cisgender straight person can expect. You know, a cisgender straight young person can look around and see visibly, this is what it's like to be male. This is what it's like to be female. This is what it's like to be married. There's not that same kind of visibility for young persons. And so it's a very different challenge here. It's not that there's the same level of rejection, but there's still a hiddenness and a mixed messaging that, again, leads to a lot of struggle in terms of understanding, well, what's my legitimate interior experience? Like I want to come out, I feel this attraction to someone of the same sex, but how do I do that well? What does it mean? How do I discern that? That's a new kind of question that requires, again, a different kind of presence and a different kind of accompaniment. At the same time, young people have not received, young Catholics anyway, whether they're straight or gay, whether they're cisgender or transgender, have not received the kind of religious education that previous generations have received. And so they come to these questions and to this mixed experience with all sorts of questions about their identity as Catholics. Do I even want to bother? Is often, you know, you have lots of people, straight or gay, cisgender or transgender, who just walk away from the church. There's just not enough for them, not enough depth, and they go looking for spiritual answers elsewhere. I want to give you again two examples, Samuel and Anthony. Samuel is a young man who came to me again, while I was still on staff at Our Lady of Lourdes, who came to me after walking away from the church at the age of 12 or 13. And he was now 19, turning 20. And Samuel had walked away from the church because at 12 years old, 13 years old, he had come to terms with being gay. he was lucky enough to belong to a family that accepted him, that that welcomed his coming out, that supported him. But unfortunately, his parish experience was very different. And because he was secure in his identity, because he was accepted at home, when he experienced rejection at the parish and a little bit at the Catholic school where he was, he simply said, well, then I don't need the church. I'll go elsewhere for my spiritual search. And Samuel was someone who already had a certain depth of spiritual experience, spiritual awareness. And so he walked away and went really into kind of creation-centered spiritualities and things like that, which served him well for a while. But at 19, he came to realize that while that had sort of carried him through his teen years, he wanted more. He wanted greater depth, and he wanted the life of the sacraments, and he wanted the relationship with Christ, and so came back. He's a very good representative of the kind of secure and confident at the kind of the psychosocial level young LGBTQ person who wants to understand where they belong in the church, but are not willing to internalize rejection. It's very, very different from previous generations. Anthony, on the other hand, again, someone who lived an openly gay life, was partnered, was a Catholic school teacher, and for the most part experienced a certain level of acceptance. He understood that that he wanted, he understood that he needed to be careful about how visible he was in the Catholic school setting, because the particular school board where he was not necessarily all that open. Nevertheless, was comfortable and open about his life. When his partner left him, his marriage fell apart, he came to Direction looking for some support, some help in processing that reality. But what the end of the partnership triggered in him was a deep lack of self-confidence and a fear of discovery. So that one of the issues that all of a sudden he had to face, which he had not had to face before, was a certain level of fear that his belonging in the church, in which he had felt previously confident, could be threatened or could be taken away from him. And that became a huge issue for Direction. But again, someone who really had not come to accompaniment with a long sort of history of psychological woundedness or a sense of needing to be reconciled with the church, more a desire to understand what is my place in the church and what is my identity and mission in the church, much as it was for Samuel. I would say these two men are representative of the kind of issue that perhaps younger LGBTQ plus persons who are seeking spiritual accompaniment, whether they're deeply Catholic or not, this is much more what's going on now. So you have there a panorama of the various kinds of concerns, questions, struggles that LGBTQ persons bring to spiritual accompaniment, to spiritual direction. I want to say one last thing in this kind of storytelling phase or sharing phase about trans persons, because trans persons also come to spiritual accompaniment. The few that I've walked with, they also come with a sense of struggling to trust their interior experience, but for very different reasons. With gay men, with lesbians, with bisexual persons, a lot of the doubt comes from the social experience. With trans persons, there's a different interior experience because many have lived with an interior experience that tells them that they're not the kind of person that their body tells them they are. That experience of milder or deeper dysphoria, disconnectedness, and disconnection from physical experience is precisely part of the struggle for people who are trying to understand, who am I called to be? You know, if I'm a male in a female body or a female in a male body, I know I'm using terms loosely, but basically that experience of wrongness in their interior life, that's been with them for a long time. And so it's not, in addition to maybe some social messaging, which would be the same as for gays and lesbians, bisexual, asexual people, trans persons have got to come to terms with an interior experience that seems distorted, or at least that is a real challenge in terms of the relationship of themselves to their bodies. I'm probably not putting that very well, but it's very important to realize this, because this is also something that requires a great deal of discernment. At the same time, in terms of how transitioning is handled in society, and particularly in the medical profession now, there's some real hurdles there. There's some real challenges there. Everyone agrees, as far as I can tell, as I listen to medical experts and psychologists and the trans persons I've walked with, everyone agrees that there needs to be a great deal of counseling, accompaniment, helping the person come to terms with their interior experience, make choices about it, before any kind of medical or clinical intervention begins. That's all true on paper. And certainly, you know, I want to flag a program that I really respect, which is the program at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, where in fact, all of these steps are in place. But too often, and again, I'm relying here on what's been shared with me by trans persons, too often, the medical profession wants to jump to the medical or the clinical or the hormonal intervention. And so someone who goes to see a doctor, if the doctor is accepting of the trans person, very, very quickly will move to hormonal therapy, will raise questions of surgery. And that's not necessarily a very healthy way to proceed. Helping people come to terms with their interior experience is really important. And again, this is somewhere that I think the Ignatian tradition can be very helpful. And in my experience has been very helpful as I've walked with trans persons. Okay, so there you have, through kind of storytelling a little bit, a sense of what LGBTQ persons bring when they approach me for direction. I want to say something very quickly about what the Ignatian spiritual tradition has done for me as I have accompanied people. And then I want to say something about the themes and the movements that the Ignatian spiritual tradition brings to walking with LGBTQ persons. So what has accompanying people in the Ignatian tradition done to me or for me? I think that one of the great gifts that the exercises have given me as I walk with LGBTQ persons is what in the Ignatian tradition we call cura personalis, care for the whole person. The stance of someone who directs in the Ignatian tradition, who accompanies in the Ignatian tradition, is that we have care for the whole person. We are concerned with every dimension of the person's interior experience and life. And so it's not a question of isolating, you know, the moral or the spiritual or the psychological or the physical and dividing the person into parts, but it's really trying to focus on what is going to help this person flourish and grow before God and in relationship with Christ. And so as I listen, I'm listening for that kind of wholeness, and I'm listening for the movements that point to that greater life, that greater freedom, that greater gift of agency, empowerment that represents being a whole and healthy and happy human person before God in relationship with Christ. And that includes the fact that the person is not self-contained. Being in relationship with God in the Ignatian tradition is not about sort of being this enclosed unit that kind of just rests in and basks in this kind of self-enclosed happiness. As I've already suggested when I talked about the contemplatio, the Ignatian tradition is all about being aware of being loved, actively loved by God, and responding to that love in service of the neighbor, so that I incarnate love of God in and through active service to the neighbor, where that self-gift is the expression of my relationship with God. And so there's a kind of built-in ongoing self-transcendence through service, through self-gift, that's part of what it means to be a human being in the Ignatian tradition, in this particular way of appropriating the Christian life. And so that's the stance that the Ignatian tradition puts me in as I listen. And that's been a real gift, because it frees me from worrying about this or that detail of church teaching, or, I mean, all of those things are important, but my goal as I listen is to help the person in front of me take all these things into account, but within the framework of a life that is an expression of a relationship with God through service, through self-gift, through love of neighbor. And that transforms how I've listened. It really has. Yes, it involves healing. Yes, it involves helping the person achieve self-acceptance. Yes, it involves knowing oneself as loved by God, but it involves mostly and mainly being attentive as a spiritual director, as one who accompanies, being attentive to the trajectory of God's love through the life of that person, that thread or that trajectory that helps the person understand who they are before God and what they are called to do because of that identity in love of neighbor. I would say the second key element is the one that I've already talked about a lot when I've shared about the spiritual experience that people, LGBTQ persons, bring to me when they come for direction, and it's given the title to this talk. It's the business of learning to trust one's own spiritual experience. Ignatius is very clear that my stance as a director is to trust that the person has a spiritual experience, that God is actively laboring in their lives to bring them to a place of greater agency, greater freedom, greater ability to give of themselves to the neighbor in love of God. And so to trust that the Creator is dealing with the creature, to use Ignatius's language, and not to put myself in there as if God needed me to mediate something, but rather I'm attentive to the way in which God is already dealing with the person who's in front of me, so that my trust of their spiritual experience can be an instrument of them beginning to trust their experience. And so that fundamental stance that's given the title to this talk, learning to trust my spiritual experience. I can support that in the person by showing that I trust their spiritual experience as the director. The Ignatian examen has been an important tool in fostering that acceptance and trust of their own spiritual experience. It's a prayer, it's a discipline of prayer that really fosters and encourages the person's attentiveness to their interior movements and gives them some clues as to what that spiritual experience means. You know, the language that Ignatius uses of consolation and desolation is very useful in helping people come to trust their interior life. I often will not use Ignatius's language of consolation and desolation at the beginning. Those words are ambiguous and can mean a lot of things to people. Instead, I'll often use Galatians 5 and the language of the fruits of the Spirit. That there are these experiences of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, of greater peace, greater joy, greater patience. You know, very much it's important for Ignatius, again, that there's this trajectory of self-transcendence, this trajectory of generosity and zeal. So that movement of greater love, greater hope, greater joy, greater peace. Talking about it that way goes a long way in helping people understand the experience of consolation and helping them recognize it. That experience of discerning among life-giving interior experience and paralyzing interior experience, or death-dealing interior experience, and pulling back from the kind of exteriorizing forces that are at work in society, and in the case that I evoked of younger LGBTQ people, those forces that want to keep the gay experience, the LGBTQ experience, very shallow and superficial. That's what the Ignatian tradition has done for me as one who accompanies. I want to talk a little bit about what I've seen happen with LGBTQ persons as I've accompanied them using the tools of the exercises in the Ignatian tradition. It's wonderful to see someone who finally comes to have an encounter with God, who has taken the initiative and is already laboring for the person's good. Very often when you read literature that tries to talk about the LGBTQ plus experience in the Christian church or in the Christian community, you'll hear, a language like God accepts me, or for a while, it was very, very popular, God don't make no junk. But that often remains very intellectual. And there are a lot of people out there who hear that message and receive it, but it remains an idea. What happens as people, for example, use the examen, as they learn to pray with the scriptures, with contemplation, with Lectio Divina in the Ignatian tradition, what happens is they don't just have this idea that God loves them, they encounter the God who loves them. And that's a very powerful moment in the life of an LGBTQ person. Well, in the life of anyone, but in the life of an LGBTQ person who even to this day, although as I say, it might be less for some, does experience rejection, does experience exclusion at various levels, maybe not with the psychological woundedness of the past, but still exclusion and rejection. To have this encounter with God is an experience of belonging that is so firmly rooted interiorly that it leads to an interior freedom that can face rejection and exclusion without internalizing the violence of that. That can face the exclusion and rejection and even conflict that one might experience with equanimity and interior peace and greater spiritual freedom, so that there's an autonomy that is part of the fruits of the Ignatian spiritual tradition, an agency that grows. And that's a wonderful moment to see in the life of someone, of an LGBTQ person in particular. That fostering of interior freedom does heal wounds, but it leads to an ability, a freedom to express oneself in one's own voice, to make of one's life a work of art in response to God's love. I would call it a mature autonomy in relation to God and in relation to the neighbor. I would say that's one of the key gifts of the Ignatian spiritual tradition for LGBTQ persons. From that experience of belonging, the person learns to trust God and learns to trust themselves and their experience, to believe that they belong in the church, to believe that they have a role to play, and to begin to, in that stance of trust, of confidence, of belief, to begin to work out who they are called to be before God in the community, so that they become that through concrete choices in response to God's love. I think we can summarize that experience, or maybe articulate it, would be better to say, in 4 themes. As the LGBTQ person journeys through a process of being accompanied in the Ignatian tradition, 4 different moments or themes, moments occur. The first is that I learn, having learned to trust my interior experience, having learned that I do belong, that I am loved, that I am accepted in this very existential way, I'm able to recognize that God loves me as I am and actively seeks me out, showering me with gifts. So again, that business of the contemplatio, that love shows itself in action. God actively seeks me out, has been seeking me out, And it's not just an idea, it's something that I've come to taste and savor in my life. That's the first thing. And then from that place, I would say there's a second moment of letting God, letting Jesus reveal to me who I am before God, letting God show me what my identity is as a person beloved by God. You know, when you're in a loving relationship, you learn who you are partly, or even most significantly, through the perceptions that you receive, the way in which the partner, the lover, treats you. If this person treats me in this way, this is who I am in their eyes. And that's a good thing. We sort of mediate our identities to each other in love. That's wonderful. It's part of being human. That second moment is letting God show that to me, learning to discern who God thinks I am, wants me to be, desires me to be, in response to his love. And that's the second moment, letting God reveal to me who I am and accepting that. Because that becomes the basis then, having a sense of that grounded identity, which doesn't come from what people think of me or say of me, or how they might exclude me or not, or accept me or not, but firmly grounded in that relationship with God, knowing who I am before God. That empowers the LGBTQ person to then ask the question, well, if this is who I am, how am I called to express this concretely through action in the Christian community, in the world? So that I begin to craft an identity as an LGBTQ plus person in the community where I know I belong. And that leads to the fourth moment, which is a discovery of how I fit in the community. It's a discovery of, as I share these gifts, as people receive them, I begin to realize that I am incarnating, I'm occupying a space in the community that is mine, and that is how I fit. And so there's that understanding of not just who I am before God, but who I am in the church and in the world. And how I incarnate that. I think I want to leave things there for now. I think I've said a lot in a short time, and all that remains for me really is to thank you for your kind attention and to invite you now into the question period, which follows this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gilles. I note you have answered a lot of the questions already, but we do have some that still need to be answered. Could you please clarify if the names that you mentioned, Richard and Mark, were they the names of the people you worked with, or did you just put in other names to hide their identity?
So those are names that I came up with for these people. They're not the real names of the persons. One of the things that a spiritual director is bound to do is protect confidentiality and anonymity.
Okay. How would you help an LGBTQ plus person who was struggling with church teaching? How would you accompany them?
Yeah, often people come to direction, and that seems to be the most urgent question for them. I need to deal with this. I need to reconcile myself to this teaching in some way. Either I have a desire to follow it, or I can't accept it. I can't. People come with all sorts of concerns about the church's teaching on homosexuality. I usually encourage people to not deal with it right away. Precisely for the reasons I gave in the talk. Dealing with matters of conscience, which is what we're talking about here, being able to respond in conscience to this or that teaching of the church requires a great deal of spiritual maturity and spiritual freedom. And so how do I help them? Well, I help them develop a spiritual life, and I help them have these experiences of belonging, this sense of being connected to Christ in the Christian community. And from that experience, I think then, particularly the experience of having found a fit for themselves in the Christian community, from that place, then it becomes possible to deal with questions of, for example, what's the difference between the church as the people of God and the institutional church, and how do I, as a baptized Catholic, take a stance in conscience before God on these teachings? That's something that requires a great deal of work. Now, I'm giving you the spiritual director's answer. The confessor's answer is a little bit different. People who come with this question to the sacrament of reconciliation, there my responsibility is to help them make sense of their moral experience on this specific question, and to lead them to a point where they themselves, people think the confessor's job is to give permission or not, but in a case like this, the confessor's responsibility is to place the person before their conscience and before the Lord. That's very different from how I would work as a director. As a director, I much prefer to take my time and help the person, develop this interiority, this grounding, this sense of belonging, this experience of being a member of the people of God, and that can't be taken away from them. And from that place, make a mature and free discernment in conscience about what stance they're going to take towards the teaching.
In what ways can gay people flourish within the Catholic community?
All sorts of ways. There's another question that came up during the talk about all-inclusive ministries and the experience there and what happens there. All-inclusive ministries is this rather unique experience that we have at Our Lady of Lourdes. The community of all-inclusive ministries sees itself as a bridge between the LGBTQ plus community and the church. And thank you. I noticed somebody just put the website address in the chat. Specifically, all that AIM does is provide a place of welcome, provide a place where people can have specific activities to help them deepen their spiritual life communally. So there'll be movie nights, there'll be there's reading groups, there's spiritual conversation and sharing of spiritual experience, and the Eucharist and the monthly Mass. And these specific activities are designed to support the flourishing. Again, you know, the kind of flourishing we're talking about is of the whole person. And so, sorry, I'm going to go far afield if I go that direction. So I'm just going to stop there and keep going where I was going before. And so AIM offers these opportunities for experiences of belonging that ground a sense of confidence and trust in myself, in the Christian community, in God, and grounded in that trust, I can become a certain kind of person, a member of the community, and take some leadership. I think, you know, if I want to leave everyone with a message, it's that the flourishing that God desires for anyone, straight or gay, cisgender, transgender, queer or not, asexual or bisexual, two-spirited or whatever, the flourishing God desires for people is that experience of incarnating love of God in my life through a generous giving of myself to others. That's flourishing in the Ignatian tradition. And you know, that's as open to straight people as it is to gay people, as it is to cisgender people, transgender people. It's that fullness of life that is free to give itself out of love. That's flourishing. I went a little bit all over the place with that one, but there it is.
I think we have time for just one more question. Could you respond to the criticism that LGBTQ plus people are self-serving and selfish in wanting to belong to the Catholic Church?
Sure, it's a very easy answer. They're baptized and God has chosen them. It's not about their desire, it's about their right. And I don't mean right in any kind of political sense. I mean, that's what God has made them through baptism, is members of the church. And no one can take that away from them. And so you know, being baptized carries with it certain responsibilities that they have they should have every opportunity to perform and take, you know, yeah. It's not selfishness, it's living out your baptism.
Thank you. Father Gilles, thank you for your interesting and reflective presentation. You've addressed this very sensitive and very important topic in a way that makes it accessible to our understanding. Thanks for addressing many of our questions, and thanks for giving us many more questions to reflect upon. I'd also like to thank Jose for running this wonderful day, Fanny, and our translators, Albert and Michelle. And most of all, thanks to our audience for being with us. It's for you that we're doing this. Our next session will be at 6 o'clock, a time of movement, change, and encounter, pilgrimage in Ignatian mode with Father Andre Brulette. Thank you. We'll see you then.
And thank you to everyone. A reminder that the recordings for this and all other sessions will be shared by 5 business days after today. And see you at the next session. Thank you, Gilles. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, everyone.